I'm on the lab. Let me enable screen share on this and hit caption. Okay, so this week we are going to touch on documents. Insider threats. And this is the one of the harder area because external threats, I think that we do a pretty good job technically on controlling it and be able to configure and prepare for it. I think insider threats is a factor that normally it's harder to control. It's harder to detect because the people on the inside, the employees on the inside, or the partner or the contractor, they have gone through background check. And some of them been there for many, many years. So it is harder for us to really determine. So with that, today we're going to use a little bit of the purple tool. So the purple team tools are the tools that we use on ethical hacking, or even attacker would use it for analysis purposes. But for both team, right, the blue and the red team. So red team is usually attack. Blue team is defense, so you can use it for both areas. So I thought it will be good for you to do a little bit of, and having an understanding of how to use some analytics tool for reporting, and especially when dealing with some certain type of attacks. So the insider attacks, we would see that some of the breaches can be caused by the people, and human factor, as we talked about with phishing, sometimes that can be challenging. So the insider attacks, these attacks can cause a lot of harm, and it costs the company a lot of money. So it can be in all different areas. So we can first go through the questions. So an insider is someone that's with your organization, or they partner with your organization. It could be a vendor. So for example, I hired a company to do services for me, and that's a vendor, it's a partner. I might have people who are contracting for my company or with my company to do some work for the year, and that will be the contractor. So the insider threats are threats that are happening, or the people, the insider is committing some kind of activity that causes these threats. Sometimes it could be downloading malware, and that could be accidental. Sometimes it's intentional. Employees disagreeing with another employee, they didn't get a raise, so they corrupt data and so on. So insider threats are employees or contractors who use their authorized access to cause damages or harm to the systems, to the people, to the building, and that would change the department's or the company's mission, resources, personnel, facilities, information, equipment, network, or system, right? So sometimes, like I said, it is intentional, and sometimes unintentional. So if, for example, you see bomb threats, right, from an internal entity or an insider, that could be an example of something, an insider threat that's causing harm to the facility. And then a lot of times that when we deal with insider threats, we look at how that is impacting physical, logical, and our network environment. So from the IT perspective and the security perspective, insider threats are mostly in the area of how the data, the information, equipment, network, and systems are impacted, or even the building. So ultimately your resources and your assets. And so it's harder for us to track or detect these type of threats is because usually they're very knowledgeable about the organization as they are employees or partner with the company. They have access or privilege to the sensitive data, possibly because of their position. And that makes them easier to access sensitive data because of their position. And so therefore, exploiting the vulnerability and bypassing security measures might be easier. So for example, right, like if you watch Snowden, the movie, he contracted with a company. He previously worked for the agency, and then he eventually worked as a contractor. He has access to a lot of very, very sensitive data, right? And with that, what you would see is he was able to extract the data and bypass a lot of the security measure to be able to get the data to the outside, right, through a USB drive. And he put it in the Rubik cube so that way they could detect it. And when he tossed it, it passed through the scan. So a lot of the times they really think it for the intentional type of insider threats, you see that they would think it through for the process on how data would be leaked. So I do have an article that, I included in the notes. You do see some data and some information about the quantification of money loss from a few years ago. So it truly impacted the organization. You can find this on the first page of your notes here. Okay. And so with that, we would see that some of the behaviors that would cause espionage, terrorism, and it doesn't have to be like national terrorism. It could be for the organization, and we'll classify each one. Disclosure of information that is unauthorized. And sometimes that could just be deleting files, or, corrupting or participated in some kind of transaction that's considered a crime. Right? Sabotage. So if they can't, let's say that if they can't do something, they would sabotage a certain process or even system or files. And then in the case of workplace violence, and also harassment, including sexual harassment, that kind of fall into the insider threats as well. And you'd be surprised to see the data, how much companies are paying because of workplace violence and violence in the workplace, in the organization, right, across the department or within department. So they did studies on that. And also for the intention, what are they really using the resources for? Are they supposed to be using the resources? So it really comes down to some of the three areas, right? Financial gains, that's usually is, and that the career development and leveraging the career also falls under that. So for example, like I would steal data so that way I can go to my next job and I can get a higher salary. Like let's say that I take client lists or company secret and be able to sell it to the next company because now I'm more in demand for my career. So I would have more financial gain. Sometimes simply selling the data is gonna give them more financial gain. Or in some cases, the intention is to damage or destroy or access or leak data because of personal grudges, right? They didn't get a raise or they're upset because there's a disagreement or they just don't like the company anymore. That could be the case. And then you got a group of people that make mistakes. And this is why we see a lot of ransomware. It's because of lack of knowledge and skills, or just carelessness, right? Downloading something and they didn't intend to do it. It's just they weren't paying attention or they didn't know that could cause the harm. So for the unintentional threats, it's really breaking down to two areas: accidental and negligence. Okay. So companies would tend to have policies to deal with these two areas. Negligence is when they expose organization information because they are careless. And so the example would be like they would allow someone to enter right through and bypass security measure because they're negligent. Okay. And how can we determine that? A lot of the time when you deal with incident response with insider threats, you have to do a little bit of forensic and you have to do a little bit of investigation and you have to find out like how they're accessing the system, what kind of resource they're accessing, when, right? And is it continuous? And so on. Okay. And then you also need to interview people. So investigation is needed. For the accidental, it's just mistake that's made and it's not intentional. Okay. Like people mistyping email addresses and they accidentally send sensitive data to other people instead of the intended party, right? And some of that is also carelessness too. But you know, sometimes things get pre-filled in your send to area, and that's what you would see. So in the next part, it asks you to describe the type of unintentional insider threats and give some example on how they exist in the organization. You can use the example that I took from articles and books, or I summarize some of the example there. So negligent insider threats. These people or entity expose sensitive information because they are careless. And they're generally familiar with systems or rules for IT and security and choose to ignore them, like sharing password, right? Which create risk for the organization. So in your IT policy and your security policy, you really need to address negligent insider threats. The first violation, if it is depending on what they did, right? Or what type of violation it is, we would be able to make sure that there are consequences. And in some cases, right, we need to retrain them and make sure that they sign an agreement that they will not do that again. So verbal warning type or written warning, etc. So simple things like employee leaves workstation unlocked, allowing others to access sensitive files and system. And some of it is on purpose. A lot of time it is on purpose, right? Let's say they leave for the day, and if we don't implement, log out after a certain period of inactivity, or they would say, hey, I'm going to leave my workstation on, so that way, the person that comes in at night will be able to finish the task for me. So that means it's, they're sharing credential and it's intentional. So some of this is in the gray area, right? You have to ask, like, is it unintentional or is it intentional? And sometimes that can be hidden. So if they purposely leave it on so that way someone else can access it, that's intentional, right? But if they just like had to go to the bathroom and forgot to log out, right? And the system did not log them out, some of the application could be sensitive, that has sensitive data, then that could be unintentional. And then you have accidental insider threats. These are the people who make mistakes and they didn't intend to cause a certain risk. So sometime, like an example that I've used here, that they had lost a storage drive, like a USB that contains some information that they wanted to take home to work on, and they had dropped it in the parking lot, for example. And that can cause data leak, right? They didn't intend to drop the USB drive or the drive in the car, but if I was managing this area, you want to make sure that they don't take data outside, right? All data can be accessed remotely, and they just need to authenticate once they get home. But then you have to make sure that they know how to control the data once they download and access it. So some company would allow them to put it on their storage device, right? Encrypt it, take it home, decrypt it, and then be able to access it. So if you implement encryption, there would not be like a less chance of the data is leaking, right? So we have to take a look at these things and say, what are we not doing, right, in the security in the IT area to reduce the risk in the case that they make mistakes, because mistakes are bound to happen. Okay. So there are many ways that we can also prevent these things from happening from our side, right? Not forcing the user. The users are going to have a certain behavior and habits. And that's expected. Because otherwise we won't have job security for sure. Any question? And you don't have to put verbatim, right? You can also use the example from the textbook or the notes. There's some examples here. Right? Like they would click on a certain hyperlink, downloading certain attachment because they did not know, they were not trained. Now you have the intentional insider, and these are malicious insider. They are very stealthy. It's a lot more difficult to detect. Usually, they can, and some of it we'll talk about how some of this can go into other area like espionage. But so the action that's taken is usually for personal benefits or personal grievance. That means that they're upset with the company, possibly because not having a raise or not having bonuses, or they wanted to make more money. Okay. So promotional bonuses, desirable travel, and the action could be leaking sensitive data, harassing another associates. And, cyberbullying is big in this area too. So they might be sending offensive messages and images or even video. So the context, you kind of have to look at the context as well. Destroying equipment, and sometimes could be violent. Any question regarding unintentional before we move to the next? Number 3. So the question 3 asks you to describe intentional threats and give an example of how these threats impact the organization. Intentional threats are insiders who take action to cause harm to the organization for personal benefit or for personal grievance. And simple example is they steal data to advance their career or gain financially, right? Like I can sell the data to the competitive company and I will be able to make a little bit more money because they didn't give me the bonus this year. I'm going to do that. So I attended one of the DoD conference a couple years ago, and they were talking about like how they were investigating some of the things that were happening for American organizations, right? Our organization here in the United States. And a lot of it has to do with espionage when we get to it. But, professors, right, who are doing research for universities like Stanford or some of, Harvard, things like that, are actually bought and paid by the entity to leak data. There are people, engineers, right, workers with space company and aerospace company that are bought and paid, right? So the FBI were tracking them, the DoD were, they were following up with like certain incidents and things. And they have pictures of these people, like going to meetings, having dinner with, like supposedly whoever that is paying them to obtain designs and things, right? Like they were talking about one of the planes that Boeing had previously designed and that got leaked. And then sure enough, you see a similar design in China and in other nations. So, you know, so it's kind of really interesting on how things are detected within the organization or even our government, right? Agencies are noticing these things and following these people because ultimately some of it can jeopardize the nation's health and security. Any question regarding intentional insider threats? No? Okay. So before we answer 4, let's look at what these means. And other type of threats are collusive. Those are just more than one. So you would have 2+ people. It could be a group. Maybe one would be recruiting another one to, commit things like theft. Or even, because sometimes, right, they feel like working in a team would probably be more efficient. And they would be able to execute certain tasks quicker. So collusive just means that you have a subset, a group, more than one individual. And then when you have third-party threats, those are your vendors, partners, people who are involved with your organization through contracts, or agreements. And it might be direct or indirect. Sometimes that they are working directly, and impacting directly, and sometimes not. Okay. So for 4, it asks you to determine the type of insider threats given the scenario. So A, it says a staff member who collaborates with the branch manager to steal data from the organization for financial gains. And this is probably gonna need a lot of tracking, right? If it is through financial systems, like if they transfer funds and things like that, or they have a slush fund and then they would transfer that. Or even when you're looking at banking, right? You know how when they withdraw, when they're dealing with cash, manager has to be present sometime that they would collaborate and then execute the activities, the fraudulent activities. So this, because they collaborate and work together, it is collusive, and it is intentional. So it's planned. For B, an employee who mistyped email addresses and sent sensitive information to external recipient. And this would be unintentional insider threats. And it could also be just by mistakes or it could be negligent, but it falls under unintentional insider threat. Now, from an IT side, right, and security side, what can we do better? We would need to implement email security, screening sensitive data that's going out, requiring more approval of sensitive data that's going out. So if it's going out to an external individual outside company, right, we would set up the rules. Let's say that this is an Excel spreadsheet that contains social security number of, clients or customer or healthcare patients or whatever it is. Then we would make sure that we check the content for the type of PII that we're working with. So, so instead of leaking it, we can control it where it stops at our server. Someone would take a look at it to make sure that all the emails intended for a certain recipients, and then the content will be okay for those recipients. And you can automate this process through rules, and configuring those rules for email security. And then for C, contractor who uses his access to obtain company's proprietary designs for career advantages. It is intentional and it is a third-party threat because he's a contractor. And then the last one, manager of the company's partner works with a group of employees to steal equipment from shipping warehouse to sell the equipment online for financial gains. And there's an incident that just happened like a week plus ago, right? It turns out to be like I think it was a warehouse for Best Buy. And they actually caught the chain, right? Like the group of people. So they operate out of multiple cities, and they have connection with logistics. So what happened is, they slowly would start getting like big screens and electronics, and then be able to funnel that out. And then they have a location where they would deposit it. So these trucks that comes in to bring to the warehouse that's owned by the company, they got diverted, or they brought them to other warehouses. And so when they did the attack, it was all at once. So it was harder to track, but I guess law enforcement, they were able to get a hold of it. They investigated, they caught the whole group. So in a case like this, and sometimes they would sell equipment online, right? Or through marketplaces, like what you see with social media. And this is a third party, it's collusive and it's intentional. So why do we care about this if we're a pen tester, right? When you pen test, you also have to look at potential threat on the inside, right? Because there could be attacker on the inside as well. So you have to check that. Any question? We don't have that many questions today because the unit's fairly short. So these are your industry expressions of insider threats, as you can say. We already talked about intentional and unintentional, and that would be like in all areas. So I borrowed this picture from one of the article. But you would see that it would manifest into violence, espionage, sabotage, theft, or even cyber acts. And, because of physical security, we have to mine all of these things. And then when you work in a position for national security, right? Like when you're dealing with, the government, nations, and things like that, you have to be mindful of all of these things. So workplace violence, common, right? It includes harassment, sexual harassment, bullying, offensive jokes, threatening, verbal threats, along with physical threats, right? And that actually costs company quite a bit of money still, okay? Then terrorism is just unlawful use of threat with the violence, employees, members associated with the company against that organization. And, the news really displays some of these incidents fairly well. People get fired or they're upset with so-and-so spouse or, whatever or not. And then, you have these shootings that happen in workplaces. And then with that, you also have lawsuits, right? Back and forth in the area of violence in the workplace. And then espionage, this is just to convert practice of spying or, seeking a certain type of confidential information with military, political strategy, financial advantage for financial gain. And it kind of breaks down into two areas, economic and government, right? Convert practice to obtain trade secrets from a foreign nation. Like, let's say that, they are looking at tank designs or even, smart military equipment, and be able to sell that to another nation for gain of money. And so even methods, technique, processes, applications, code, stuff like that, or drugs, scientific research. And then the government is just to gather some intelligence for political or military advantage. Okay. And a lot of times you would see companies that are affiliated with governments are impacted. Okay, like, Boeing might design a fighter jet and someone could leak the engineering design. And then you have the criminal where secrets for the nations is being shared. Okay. So for the next question, it asks you to provide example of organizational violence. I'm sure you can think of one, right? The notes already provide you with some of the general one. So an employee can threaten another employee because they just simply disagree, right? Sometimes people personality don't match, but some people, they would verbally threaten another person or physically threaten another person. And often that you also see cases in media and everywhere where new employees are bullied or harassed by the manager because they're new, right? You have to do this because, and in organization, they should have policy against that, but sometimes they don't report it because they're afraid that they will lose their job or, there are other areas that would generate some kind of fear in reporting these incidents. And then sexual harassment is also very big, right, in corporate and enterprises. And that can generate a lot of loss through, lawsuits and other things, people getting hurt, etc. So harassment between supervisor and staff based on promotion, pro. I'm pretty sure many of us who work in different areas have to go through sexual harassment training, right? Career advantages, usually promotion promise, things like that. And that could be from higher up, or it could be low or even mid-level management or colleagues and things like that. And then manager sends messages containing sexual images to his team members. I actually experienced this one. I had a former supervisor that would send pictures that represent phallic symbols. Yeah, he would send picture that would look like sexual organs, and he thinks it's funny. So on a group chat or something like that, there would be popping up messages, and he said, "Oh, look, this is, an island off of somewhere in the Pacific, blah, blah, blah. Is it funny?" Right? And it is very offensive. Okay. And that sometimes stem from, for sexual harassment. And then former employee threatens to burn the company building or shoot people, or yeah, it goes on, right? You see it all over the media. And some of the sad school shooting ones are also, could also be caused by insider, right? Or people who are related to the insider. You look at like Virginia Tech shooting, what happened? It was the student that got upset with the professor, right? And that's how it started. I guess it was some form of bullying over times based on what the media was saying in his case, right? And he was fed up with it, so he went from room to room and he started shooting. And then the same thing happened with the UCLA case and other. I think the UCLA one was the individual was a PhD candidate. Sometimes that can be frustrating that, you can't finish because someone's subjective opinion is jeopardizing your whole entire academic career that you work hard for. And that can make someone very upset. I would believe it.
Wasn't the, remember the guy that was in the administration for Hillary? What do they call him? He's the one who was sending pictures, explicit pictures to people
Yeah,
in his underwear.
it's not, yeah, not okay. Not okay. Okay. So for the next one, we have to identify different type of espionage. So the type of espionage that and how they occur in organizations. So for A, an engineer infiltrates an aerospace company and still plane designs for another company in a different country. It is economic and it is also government espionage. We don't particularly know whether it is military planes that he had acquired or the design of the military plane. So assumption that it would be, we would say government as well. So because we are utilizing so much of the digital systems that all of these things we should be able to see, right? And control. So after the incident, we have to ask ourselves, like, how did they have access to that? Right? Why are we not controlling that? Okay. And how was it being sent or taken from the facility to the next? Is it on a physical storage device or is it through, some kind of network shared? Surprisingly, a lot of companies allow you to have access to your cloud, your personal cloud, and a lot of the data leak happens that way. That people just upload it onto their personal cloud because it is personal. It is harder for the company to even track that or allowed to be tracked, right? So, because it's ownership and then, the legal aspect of it. As I mentioned to some of you, I used to work for a company that they had required me to run a tool that monitor everyone browsing history. Right? And they don't filter, but if let's say that you're at your desk and you're doing online shopping and you're not supposed to, right? That person is going to get a warning like tomorrow. So at the end of the day, I have to send a report of all the user who are accessing the internet that is not for business purposes. Right? And through that process, I had discovered someone regularly watching pornography, also youth pornography at between the hour of 3 and 5 p.m. right before he went home. And so with that, it was, I didn't really like having that responsibility, but through that process, I kind of appreciate a little bit of the responsibility that we had caught the person, but I also felt like it was impeding of privacy for many people. So I was like back and forth whether, I disagree at the beginning. I didn't really wanted to do it because of privacy purposes, but yeah, they had escorted him out and the police was waiting outside for sure. Okay. So,
Is that because he was using the school?
yeah, it was the business equipment, the business equipment that he was using.
Oh,
And even, nowadays, if you're using Internet of Things or your own personal device, if you attach yourself to the wireless network, yeah, they can see everything. You guys know Wireshark can see everything, right? Like, so I don't think it should be questionable, right? Like, if you don't want other people to see what you're seeing, then just don't do it. Yeah, don't use it. Go home and use that, whatever that you're doing inside your home. Just don't let people see. Okay. B, senior developer from China was paid by China government to leak U.S. utility infrastructure software code, and that's government and criminal. And then U.S. researcher leaked U.S. government weapon design to Russia, and that's government and criminal. And then executive was paid to leak client data to a competing company. That's economic. And you have, APT that are doing this also, right? Certain APT group, advanced persistent threat group. And if you look at Wikipedia, it's always growing and changing, right? I think now it's what, close to 200 or even more. Before there were just like a small number, and then because there are different groups, and some of them operate in the criminal related area, so they're paid by certain government, right? Through the DoD training, I was told that, there's like a non-mark building that house a lot of very youth hackers in China. So they groom them, right? And as young as 12 to 16. So, and they're trained with a lot of these tools. So, and they were talking about cyber warfare, and they have pictures of it, which is, the FBI agent that was talking to us, he was showing us some of the picture that they had taken from like either drone, or it seems like an aerial view, but they had zoomed in, and a lot of the kids were all male. A lot of the kids were very, very young, right? They look like they're like 10 to me, but okay. For financial crime and an intellectual property could be design, it could be, like writing, it could be, so and there's a gray area between what is really individual intellectual property and companies' intellectual property. Sometime, when the engineer, the person who create or use the resource of the company to create a design or to create a product, etc., right? That could also be considered partially owned by the company. It's really depending on the company policy, but most of the time, legally, that's how it's seen. And then when that person take the design, because they thought that it's their design, but they're using resource of the company, it becomes, an issue, right? In this area where we would see that it is intellectual property theft. So a financial crime, when someone steals shipments, right, from the warehouse, or financial crime could also be that account payable staff send him or herself or themselves payments. And then intellectual property theft, researcher sells new drug formula to a competitive company, so they have to steal the design or the research and then sell it to the competitive company. And you see this in technical area like smartphones, you see it everywhere. And then for D7, intellectual property theft, and you don't have to have all four, I'm just giving you numerous, and you can think of your own example. An engineering contractor steals machinery designs to leverage his new job negotiation. That's what happened with Facebook and Oculus, right? You guys ever read the case with Oculus? So Oculus is owned by Facebook. You know that the company that makes the VR goggle. So the CIO for Oculus, right, had left Oculus.
Oculus is that virtual reality.
Yeah, before Facebook bought Oculus and promised Facebook that he would bring the design with him. If so there was negotiation that happened, and then eventually Facebook bought Oculus because they already acquired all the design for the goggle, right? So Oculus, they did try to sue Facebook, but that didn't go very far. I think they did pay some, but not what the demand for Oculus was. So Facebook acquired Oculus just because they didn't want that lawsuit to be, bigger. But the CIO for Oculus actually went to Facebook prior to that, and they have, so they dug up all of the conversation and all of these things that were happening on chat messages and things like that, and that's how they found out. that he had brought the design, he had leaked the design before he actually went to Facebook. And then Facebook said, you know what, we'll just buy the company because just to avoid, I think they wanted like $11 million or whatnot, more money into the lawsuit, but they did pay. I heard they paid like close to almost 50% of what they asked. And this was years ago, and Oculus been owned by Facebook for many, many years now. So that happens too, right? Executive wise, sometimes, they just want the bigger salary. And then, or working reputation with the company like Facebook or now Meta, right? What you see is, that could be leverage for them in the long run. So Cyber Insider, I think that a lot of the example that we're dealing with systems, right? Or clicking link, downloading file, transactional data, those are all cyber related. So for question 8, you just have to identify the type you can go through. So on certifications, you're gonna have scenarios and things like that. You just have to be able to distinguish them. An employee clicked on a link up an advertisement pop-up ad, which costs, I think I have a grammatical error here, which caused the malware to be downloaded on the system, and it could be unintentional, right? It looks like they didn't know what they were doing, so unintentional cyber insider threats. And even if they're careless, it still falls under unintentional. So similar to the prior question, if you can distinguish between intentional and unintentional. And then for B, a manager removes group permissions from various folders and deletes important files from the network drives before leaving the company, right? Because maybe that this person thought that, they contributed to those files for the company, right? And so if they're upset, they wanted to take away the file, but that doesn't work that way, right? If you work for the company and you get paid by the company to create those files and participate in a group to make those files, the company owned the files, right? So the intellectual property questions come up, and sometimes attorney argues that, right? Even in the case that, they are working on those files at home and they're bringing it in, but because they're paid by the salary, a lot of the times they don't win. So intentional cyber insider threat for B. And then staff member unknowingly clicks the phishing link on the email messages, which requests her to reset login credential. That's unintentional. And that looks like a phishing link, right? It is a phishing link. So reset credentials tends to be phishing link. So with that, we omit it by doing training regularly, by making sure that we block some of the websites that the staff should not access, right? There are many things that we can do to control. Okay. So whenever that you're looking at incident, especially for insider threat, you really have to ask yourself about what are the countermeasures effective? Okay. Because, as I talked to my class last night, because they're doing CYSA, auditing is such an important area to go back and look at, are we using effective tools? Are we using effective strategies? Because these things that come up, it's a flag for you to say that maybe something is not effective and not efficient. Okay. And then on the last one for 8D, contractor plugs personal USB drive containing keylogger, capture all the user input on a system, right? It is intentional. And someone can argue that, well, maybe they didn't know that the USB drive is infected. But in this case, they want to capture all users' credential and whatever they type. So that's a Trojan, right? We know keylogger is a Trojan. And so it is cyber insider threat. That's intentional. So how can you detect or prevent insider threats? There are many areas, so I'm gonna harp on this again, defense in depth, right? By the end of the program, you should know what that is. It is layered security approach. That means that you have to look at technical control because that's where we live. You have to also manage some of the area that is outside of the technical, like administrative control. So with technical control, we have to look at access control. That's very important. Encryption when it deals with data, whether it's data in motion, data at rest, right? Data in transit, etc. We need to use proper monitoring tools to detect unusual and suspicious activities. Network-wise, we know that network monitoring tools or packet sniffers are useful. And then you have other tools that you can use. We learned them through this class so far, right?
Miss Casey, in number 9, where do you find it in the notes?
For detection,
Yeah,
hold on 1 second. If you go down, did I put that in? Threat mitigation program.
Page 4,
Yeah, thank you.
page 4, providing insight.
Yeah, that's right.
oh, thank you.
So after the espionage and the cyber threats, right? Right here. So you could just be hired to do proactive and preventative mitigation plan, right? That could be your job. But it encompasses a lot of different things. So we would start with access control. Let me move this to the next page. But it goes on, okay? Then we want to use UBA. I did look into, maybe I have to revisit this. I try to incorporate it with your lab today, but some of the tools were taking a lot of time, so we'll come back. So user behavior analytics. There are many proprietary tools that has this capability, but there is an open source package that you can use. It also works as an API, so you can incorporate that with some of the monitoring scripts that you have, and or even existing tool like SIEM system. So this particular type of analytics software, it look at, define patterns, and then determine whether you would have irregular activities for certain user. But using this type of system, you need to feed it data. Anytime that you deal with analytics, there gotta be existing or historic data. So, and then in the case of the new user, you have to give it data for a while. And it's gonna look at like what kind of things that they normally use. And then if something that's out of the extraordinary or different activities that happens, it's gonna raise notification, or, so you can have it set up where it would notify you. We need to conduct regular training and awareness program, so that way people can recognize incidents and also report incidents. I really believe that companies should do a better job in encouraging people to report incidents. A lot of times incident goes unreported because, they're afraid that they don't, and sometimes people don't want to get involved personally. But I think that if they are given opportunity to report it, it's easier to report. If it is, it doesn't cause them a lot of inconvenience, people would report it more often. And then data loss prevention, and when you see this, you might think, oh, maybe I just back up data and call it a day, right? But it also entail how to really look at unauthorized transfer of sensitive information, meaning that how they can extract the data. Such as bringing in a USB drive and pulling the data, and then taking that USB drive outside of the organization, putting it on personal cloud space, or, sending to themselves or other people via email. So how are they able to extract the data and send that out to the external resources? And then promoting whistleblower policy, encouraging people to report more often. And so some of this, we have to revisit the business process. And I know that, that doesn't, but implementing some of the business process and tying it back to the technical control, I think that's really relevant. So you need to also have administrative control, technical control, and sometimes it also needs to be physical control, right? Like, are we having surveillance of people taking equipment out of the building? Would there be any kind of information? Camera system is only deterrence. And even security guards, right? They're not gonna be there able to catch people 24/7. So how are you gonna be able to detect things like equipment theft, stuff like that, right? Or even sending people through, metal detector, that sometimes can be very offensive to certain people. But I know some places they make you do that because you can't leave facility. Their healthcare facility that you cannot bring things inside after you go through a certain gate. So if you bring a lunch, you have to check it out at the desk and someone will bring that lunch to your area, right? When you enter the building or where there's sensitive data, it's basically your hands are free. There's nothing that you want to carry. And if your smartphone, you check your smartphone. So there's high clearance places that are like that. I've been to data center. You can't bring your smartphone in there, right? You check it at the door, right? And then when you come in, there's nothing on you, just close. And then that's it. So, and implementing that can be difficult at the beginning, but after a while, people will adapt, right? There would be resistance with the user. So the common results, right, with the insider threats, what are they really, what are the companies facing at the end? And if you look at the diagram, and this came from the image that's at the end of the note sets. So the common results are financial loss. That's definite. Loss of privacy, that's definite, could be for the people that's involved or the victims. IP theft. Unauthorized disclosure could be sensitive information or data. We had a leak here at RCCD, but not, I have to look at like whether my data was impacted, but they said that it hasn't impacted anyone yet, but the leak went out, so. Disruption of IT services, so that can cause some of the system to stop working or the service to stop working. Damage to infrastructure. And then injuries or death in the case of, you see, workplace violence, right? So when you have an incident that jeopardizes privacy, you guys ever receive those privacy notice, right? Sometimes they update their policy, and by law, when they change their policy, they have to update it. A lot of the times, companies don't update policies unless something happened, right? So like if they have a breach, if they have an incident, etc., then they change their policy and their privacy policy. So with that, they have to notify all customers and all impacted or, people that are involved. Okay, so any question? I know this is lengthy, but I condensed it a little bit, so just one more. So determine the following statements is true or false. So when you build insider threat mitigation program, what should you build it upon? We need to make sure that we align it with the principle and the standards and the mission statement of the company. So their culture and their organization. So out of the box, I don't really think that there's one fit all, right? You really have to customize it to the organization. Okay. And then you need to prioritize critical assets, just like everything that we do, right? We need to make sure that we rank critical assets. Those things needs to be addressed first. Also physical and intellectual properties, that's also included in your assets. And if there's compromise, damage, or loss, or any kind of adverse impact to the mission of the company. So the first statement, A, is true. B is also true. Now, centralizing the collection of information and integration and analysis, that is useful. So if you're looking at a corporate environment, a lot of the data is being pulled from different branches and locations, right? And then that comes to one centralized area, and that's where all the analysis happens. And then from there, you would be able to determine the solution on how you can reduce some of the risks, especially for insider threats. So it is better, and it is better managed, I think, and controlled when it is centralized. So that's true for C. Then for D, build business management team for assessment response to the potential insider threats, and this is false. It's threat management team. So when you become an analyst, right, in cybersecurity, you are part of that threat management team. Your CSO, right, might be leading the team, or even some of the security manager. And then on it, you would have security engineers, and then they would have IT people and IT management people on the team, because you have to work. And sometimes that could just be one IT department. Sometimes security and IT are separate units. In the larger enterprises, that's usually the case. Sometimes you have IT service company doing your IT stuff, like doing support and maintenance, but then they have in-house security team. So you want to be part of that threat management team, and that would require you to know how to do forensic, right? Pen testing, incident response, and then building security solutions. And then lastly, create an incident response plan to address potential insider threat incidents. That's true. And in the incident response plan, you would put together the IRP, having the component with the team, who's going to be on the team, right? What kind of procedure you have. So a plan would entail, right, how you would approach certain situation, be specific, right? And you would list many different situations, and insider threat is one of them. Like how we would respond to a malware, how will we respond to an attack, how we would respond to different type of attack, and then how we would respond to insider threats and different types of insider threats, like unintentional, intentional, all of those things we've been learning so far. And somebody has to write those things, right? Could be you. Any question? Okay, let me pause the recording or stop it.